They underestimated him, dismissed him, and treated him like a fool, until he exposed a legal fraud right in front of the judge. The courtroom was already against him before he even spoke. Lucas Hunter stepped forward, his suit slightly wrinkled, his tie a little askew, but his posture was steady. He wasn't a lawyer, never claimed to be. He was just a man who refused to let his late aunt's home be stolen by a corporate giant that saw people as nothing more than numbers on a balance sheet. Judge Marcus Blackstone peered over his glasses, the corners of his mouth twitching into something between a smirk and a sneer. He leaned back in his chair, tapping his gavel lightly on the bench. "Mr. Hunter, representing yourself?" The question dripped with amusement. Lucas met his gaze. "Yes, Your Honor." A chuckle echoed from the other side of the room. Derek Wells, the opposing attorney, adjusted his cufflinks with practiced ease. He was a corporate bulldog with a record of steamrolling small-time defendants. Wells was here to do what he did best: win. And Lucas? He wasn't even a challenge. "This should be quick," Wells muttered to his assistant, who gave him a knowing smile. Lucas heard it. He was supposed to hear it, that was the point, but he kept his face still. He had been counted out before. He knew what it felt like to be dismissed, underestimated. That's why he was here. Judge Blackstone let out a sigh, flipping through a file. "This is a property dispute, correct? A foreclosure challenge?" Lucas nodded. "Yes, sir." "My aunt's home." Blackstone barely glanced at him. "And you believe you can argue this case against a seasoned attorney like Mr. Wells?" Lucas didn't flinch. "I don't believe it, Your Honor." "I know." The courtroom went quiet. A few muffled chuckles came from the corporate side of the room, but there was something else too, something unspoken, the kind of silence that comes when someone unexpected refuses to back down. Judge Blackstone shook his head. "Very well, let's get on with it." But Lucas wasn't just here to argue. He was here to win, and they had no idea what was coming. The judge's skepticism was only the beginning. The real challenge was about to come from the man sitting across the aisle, the one who thought Lucas had already lost. Derek Wells adjusted his tie with a smug smile. This was his playground, the courtroom, the rules, the strategy. He had crushed dozens like Lucas before. A man with no degree, no firm backing, no experience. This wasn't a case. It was a warm-up. Judge Blackstone exhaled sharply, rubbing his temple. "Mr. Wells, you may proceed with your opening statement." Wells rose with practiced ease, buttoning his jacket as he stepped toward the jury. His voice was smooth, confident. "Ladies and gentlemen, this case is simple." He gestured toward Lucas without even looking at him. "We have a man who refuses to accept reality. The property in question was rightfully acquired by my client through legal foreclosure. The law is clear. The facts are irrefutable. This is not about emotions. This is about contracts, deadlines, and obligations. My client followed the law. Mr. Hunter did not." A well-placed pause, a slow turn, then a casual shrug. "I sympathize. Losing a home is painful, but pain does not override legal responsibility. The numbers don't lie." He nodded once toward the judge and then took his seat, hands folded as if the case was already over. Lucas sat still, unmoved. He'd expected this, but as he rose from his seat, he caught the way Judge Blackstone leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, a man watching something he didn't believe would be worth his time. "Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen," Lucas cleared his throat, voice steady. "Mr. Wells is right about one thing. The law is clear. The question is—" A flicker of irritation crossed Wells's face. Lucas continued, "Does his client actually follow it?" A low murmur ran through the courtroom. "I've spent the last 6 months studying every case, every statute, every loophole that banks and corporations use to strip homes away from families," Lucas said, his voice growing more confident. "And I found something, Your Honor." Judge Blackstone raised an eyebrow. "Something?" Lucas nodded. Yes, and it changes everything. Wells let out a quiet laugh. Oh, this should be good. Lucas ignored him. Instead, he turned to the judge. Before I begin, Your Honor, I'd like to submit an official request for discovery. The courtroom shifted. The judge sat forward, his expression less amused now. Hiding what? He asked. The words hung in the air. Fraud. Just like that, the room wasn't laughing anymore. The word fraud lingered like a slow-burning fuse, and the smirk faded. For the first time, the judge gave more than just a passing glance. Fraud? The judge's voice carried a note of skepticism, but there was something else beneath it. Curiosity. Yes, Your Honor, I believe the foreclosure on my grandmother's home was based on forged documents, and I can prove it if I'm allowed to request full discovery. A sharp breath echoed across the room. The attorney, shaking his head, stood up to challenge it. Your Honor, this is absurd. A baseless accusation meant to stall the inevitable. The property was seized under standard foreclosure proceedings. Standard, came the calm reply, with a step forward. Tell me, how standard is it for a bank to foreclose on a house when the original mortgage documents have two different signatures from the same person? A rustle moved through the room as murmurs began to break out. The attorney's jaw clenched. What are you talking about? He demanded. I'll show you. The documents were pulled from a folder and handed up to the judge. These are two separate copies of the same document, Your Honor. One from the initial filing and one from a later modification. If you look at the signatures, you'll notice they don't match. The judge leaned in, scanning the papers, his forehead creased in concentration. Now, I'm no expert, but I know my grandmother's signature. And that second one? That's not hers. The judge flipped through the pages, his expression shifting from dismissive to focused. He looked up. Do you have an explanation for this? The attorney cleared his throat. This is an attempt to confuse the issue. Signatures can change over time. Maybe, came the measured response. But that second signature is from a document filed only 3 months after the original, and if you compare them side by side, you'll see that not only do they look completely different, but the second one was signed the day after my grandmother was hospitalized for a stroke. A wave of reaction rippled through the courtroom. The jury leaned forward. Does your client have the original signed documents on file? The attorney hesitated, barely noticeable, but the judge noticed. We would need time to retrieve them, came the quick reply. That's fine. I'll wait. The silence was different now. It wasn't just intrigue, it was doubt. And this was only the beginning. The judge exhaled through his nose, flipping through the documents again. His eyes flicked between the mismatched signatures. The attorney, already regaining control, spoke up. These documents don't change the core of the case. The defendant is grasping at straws, hoping to delay the inevitable. The bank followed the legal process. That's what matters. Letting the words settle, the response was calm and deliberate. Followed the legal process? Mr. Sterling, do you even know who your client bought this debt from? The attorney blinked. What does that have to do with anything? The mortgage was sold 3 times before it landed with the current lender, 3 separate times, but the transfer paperwork... He paused, pulling out another document from his folder. That's where it gets interesting. The judge took the papers, scanning them, his jaw tensed. Each time the loan changed hands, it should have been accompanied by an endorsement, an official transfer from one lender to the next. But look closely. The attorney shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The judge's brows knitted together. There's no signature on the last transfer. Exactly. The response was simple, which means the last company had no legal right to foreclose on my grandmother's home. And the bank that did, they never actually owned the loan in the first place. A hushed murmur rippled through the courtroom. The tension thickened. The attorney sat forward, voice tightening. Your Honor, this is... The judge cut him off. This is a problem. Taking a slow breath, the response came steady. They had been underestimated. They had laughed at him, but now they weren't laughing anymore. Exposing the fraud was one thing, proving intent was another, and that was where Jared was about to hit them the hardest. Sterling's face had lost its smugness. The confidence that had once oozed from him at the beginning of the trial was cracking, and Jared saw it. The man who had treated this case like a formality was now scrambling for control. Judge Grayson leaned forward, his tone sharp. "Mr. Sterling, I assume your client has an explanation for why this mortgage was transferred without proper endorsement?" Sterling hesitated, his composure slipping. "Your Honor, I would need to confer with my client before making a statement on that." Jared tilted his head, pressing forward. "You mean the same client who has been submitting legally questionable documents in multiple foreclosure cases just like this one?" Sterling snapped his gaze toward him. "That's an outrageous claim." Jared didn't blink. "Is it? Because I took the liberty of researching your client's foreclosure history. Turns out my grandmother's house isn't the only one they acquired under these exact circumstances." He handed up another document, another piece of evidence. The judge skimmed the papers, his expression darkening. He exhaled slowly, looking up at Sterling. "This case isn't looking as simple as you suggested." Sterling's jaw tensed, but before he could speak, Jared pressed forward. "Your Honor, I'd like to call a witness." Judge Grayson looked at him. "A witness?" Jared nodded. "Yes, the person who notarized the second mortgage signature, the one I believe was forged." A quiet gasp rippled through the gallery. This wasn't just about missing paperwork anymore. Jared was about to bring someone into the courtroom who could unravel the entire case. Sterling stood immediately. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular. This witness was not disclosed beforehand." Jared turned to him, his voice even. "That's because I only just tracked her down yesterday, and what she told me," he let the silence stretch for a beat, "changes everything." Judge Grayson studied him for a moment before turning to Sterling. "I'm allowing it." Sterling stiffened. He knew this wasn't going his way anymore, but Jared's biggest move was still coming. The door at the back of the courtroom creaked open and a woman stepped in. Linda Myers, a notary public. She looked tense as she made her way to the stand, adjusting her glasses, her fingers gripping the railing. Judge Grayson nodded toward her. "State your full name and occupation for the record." She cleared her throat. "Linda Myers, I'm a licensed notary public." Jared stood, his voice calm but firm. "Ms. Myers, do you recall notarizing the second mortgage modification for my grandmother, Alma Calloway?" Linda hesitated, glancing at Sterling. I do." Jared nodded. "And were you present when she signed the document?" Another pause. A flicker of discomfort crossed her face. Sterling shifted in his seat. Jared waited, giving her space. Finally, Linda exhaled. "No, I wasn't." A gasp rippled through the courtroom. Judge Grayson's gaze sharpened. Jared kept going. "Ms. Myers, did you witness anyone else signing on her behalf?" Linda's hands trembled slightly. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "No." Jared stepped closer. "Then how did the document get notarized?" Linda's hands trembled harder. "I was given the paperwork by a bank representative. I was told it had already been signed, and I just needed to stamp it." Another shock wave rippled through the room. She had just admitted that the signature was notarized without proper verification, making the entire foreclosure process illegal. Sterling shot up from his seat. "Objection! This is hearsay, Your Honor. She can't verify the legitimacy of the—" Judge Grayson held up a hand, cutting him off. "Overruled." His tone had lost any trace of patience. Turning to Linda, he asked, "Miss Myers, do you understand the legal implications of what you just said?" Linda nodded, her eyes glassy. "Yes, sir, I didn't know at the time, but I should have." Sterling sat down, running a hand down his face. He knew it was over. Jared turned back to the judge. Your Honor, given this testimony, the forged signature, and the missing mortgage transfer endorsements, I move to have this foreclosure nullified. My grandmother's home was taken through fraudulent means, and now the evidence is right in front of you. Silence. Judge Grayson exhaled slowly, tapping his gavel on the bench. When he spoke, his voice was firm. The court rules in favor of the defendant. The foreclosure is void. The property is to be returned immediately. Jared let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The wait, the fight, the months of endless research. It had all led to this moment. He turned, catching Sterling's hollow stare. The man who once dismissed him as nothing had just been taken down in front of an entire courtroom. But Jared wasn't thinking about him anymore. This wasn't about revenge. It was about justice. His grandmother's home would not be stolen. Not today, not ever. But the lesson here wasn't just about winning a case. It was about standing up even when no one believes you can. Jared stepped outside the courthouse, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the steps. He paused, taking a slow breath. The air felt different, not lighter, not freer, just real. The kind of real that settles in when a fight is finally over. His grandmother's home was safe, that was all that mattered. A few people from the gallery filtered out behind him, their voices hushed. Some whispered about the case, others about him. He caught snippets, words like "never saw it coming" and "that man should be a lawyer." But Jared didn't need validation. He never had. What he needed was justice, and today he got it. A voice called out from behind him, "Calloway." Jared turned to see Judge Grayson standing at the top of the courthouse steps, hands in his pockets. The arrogance from earlier was gone, replaced with something more measured. "You surprised me in there." The judge's voice wasn't warm, but it wasn't cold either. Jared met his gaze. "You weren't the only one." Grayson studied him for a moment before giving a small nod. "You ever think about law school?" Jared let out a quiet chuckle. "Not really." Grayson smirked slightly, just for a second. "Might want to reconsider. You've got a talent for making people squirm." And with that, he turned and disappeared into the courthouse. Jared exhaled, shaking his head. Law school? Maybe. Maybe not. But one thing was certain. If anyone ever tried to take what was his again, they'd better be ready for a fight. Because power doesn't just belong to the ones with money and titles. It belongs to the ones who refuse to back down. And if this case proved anything, it was this. The underestimated always have the most to prove, and when given the chance, they don't just win, they change everything.